Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Over the last few years, India and China have witnessed a tumultuous phase in their relationship. And this has a lot to do with the border clashes and the standoffs that have taken place between the sides. India has also made it clear that the bilateral relationship with China is contingent upon the resolution of some of these border issues. Today, in order to discuss this and some of the latest developments which have taken place, I have with me Manoj Kewalramani, who heads our Indo-Pacific program and is also our resident China expert at Takshashila. Welcome to All Things Policy, Manoj.
Thanks, Shrikrishna. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with what has taken place this week, right? The Indian and Chinese sides have issued a joint statement which says that, start quote, on 8 September 2022, according to the consensus reached in the 16th round of India-China Corps Commander level meeting, the Indian and Chinese troops in the area of Gogra-Hotsprings, Patrol Point 15, have begun to disengage in a coordinated and planned way, which is conducive to the peace and tranquility in the border areas. So Manoj, tell us about the significance of this phase of disengagement which has taken place in eastern Ladakh.
Right. So this is really interesting, right? I mean, one of the first things that you notice from that joint statement, which was issued on September 8th, was that it refers to the 16th round of Corps Commander talks, right? And the 16th round took place in July 18th, actually. So it's interesting that it's taken nearly 2 months since apparently this agreement was decided upon by both sides for this disengagement to take place from Patrolling Point 15. If you go back to the statement that was issued, the joint press release that was issued after the 16th round of talks, you don't really see any specific reference to this disengagement, right? It's as generic as some previous statements which talk about the fact that, look, that the resolution of these remaining issues will help restore peace and tranquility on the LAC and the western sector and will enable progress in bilateral relations. It also says things like, look, we need to resolve these issues, and that's sort of critical. So there's nothing specific that is given away in that statement, which was issued, nearly 2 months ago. And suddenly we sort of read this, suddenly in the middle of the day on the 8th of September, you get this statement from the Indian Army and from the Chinese side that this disengagement is taking place. So it's interesting that firstly, this is how it sort of happens. Why is this phase of disengagement important? Is because this was the last of the friction points that was remaining ever since this standoff began in April 2020. And when I say the last of the friction points, it's important to realize that when things began in April 2020 and the PLA soldiers came into forward positions, what had happened was that there were three specific areas where frictions had developed, right? One was this Gogra-Hotsprings region, there was the Pangong-so. So there were three areas: Gogra-Hotsprings, Patrol Point 15, and Pangong-so. In Pangong-so, we have seen disengagement take place. That was the first place where we had disengagement take place. We had Galwan, which was another area where there was where after the violence you saw disengagement taking place, and you have Gogra-Hotsprings. So among these three areas, this was the last patrolling point which was remaining for disengagement take place, as far as we know in the public domain. There is another area which is the Debsan Plains, where again there is friction, and recent reports tell us that there has been some degree of increase in friction with regard to, say, the blocking of Indian grazers and herders. And anyway, Indian troops and their access to that, to traditionally where we used to go, had been blocked pre-April 2020 also. So that is still remaining to be resolved, and that's critical from a strategic point of view. But the three areas where tensions had escalated, Galwan, Gogra-Hotsprings, and Pangong-so, in all of these today we see disengagement. Why is disengagement critical? Is because it means that basically troops had been in very close proximity and now they have pulled back. We don't have additional details of what the Patrol Point 15 disengagement is going to look like, but if it has any sort of resemblance to what has happened in Pangong-so or along the Galwan Valley or Gogra earlier, what we are likely to see is that both step back some distance and you create a buffer zone which neither accesses, but both sort of in a phased manner step back and monitor each other's retreat to a certain distance, which reduces the chance of any sort of, accidental, unintentional escalation. So to that effect, it's a positive change. And this was the last of the 3 points remaining. So that's why it's significant.
So, from what I understand, this is not exactly a revert to the status quo which existed before these standoffs started taking place, but rather the creation of a buffer zone where both the parties, cannot enter. So, why is this disengagement happening now? And also, I wanted to ask you, how do you interpret the timing of this decision, given that the 16th round Corps Commander talks was held on July 16th, as you mentioned, and some commentators have also linked this to the upcoming SCO meeting, right? So,
Yeah.
what do you have to comment about the timing?
Yeah, look, it's interesting, right? I mean, again, it's nearly 2 months after that last core commander meeting. It's out of the blue. This disengagement at Petrol Point 15, if I remember correctly, in August last year, there was a 12th round of core commander level talks at which both sides agreed on disengagement in the area of Gogra. But PP-15 was still remaining, which is Hot Springs. That was still remaining. And that was supposed to have been the next step. This is August last year. So it's been more than a year since this has taken place. And from what we understand, there is no new formulation that's come up. It's essentially the same formulation that we've seen in other places. So it's essentially Beijing and the PLA being stubborn and rigid about stepping back, whereas the formula was there for a very, very long time. So that brings us to the question as to why would they do it now and why not in the past? I don't think there was any tactical or strategic gain that the PLA was getting by persisting in the standoff at PP-15. It was, things had essentially ossified between the two sides. Both sides had built up troops, and brought up additional troops, started building up additional infrastructure, starting, sort of in some ways changing the nature of the LAC, which previously used to be patrolled with mutual agreement and with very limited force presence. All that has changed. There has been far greater force presence. So I don't see, there is no sort of rational military logic for the PLA to keep holding on to the position that it had at Petrol Point 15. It was essentially political, right? You could have stepped back and created this buffer zone in the past, like you had done in the other areas. But from a political point of view, you wanted to keep that pressure on. You felt that there was some value in maintaining that and not stepping back. So why now? To me, the only sort of rational thought that comes to mind is that you want to, that in the next week, ever since the standoff began, April 2020, you had no engagement between the Indian and Chinese leaders, right? So Narendra Modi has had no direct bilateral engagement with President Xi Jinping. They've met in multilateral forums, but not even at the sidelines of multilateral forums. And while Prime Minister Modi has traveled to different places, Xi Jinping has not left China ever since the pandemic began. But next week, which is on 15th of September, is the SCO summit in Samarkand. And we are expecting Xi Jinping to travel for that summit. There's no confirmation of a meeting between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, but it is likely that there could be a meeting. But regardless of that, I think that the value of traveling to an international meeting, international summit, and potentially having a bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping. I mean, that's the only reason that I can think of where this would be done at this point of time. If you go back to the Doklam standoff in 2017, the standoff, I mean, if you look at sort of, it was 75, 77 days standoff. If you look at Chinese narrative during that standoff, it was extremely aggressive, whereas the Indian narrative was actually quite relaxed, quite toned down. It was quite rational, whereas the Chinese narrative was incredibly aggressive, threatening war even at one point of time. Yet it's, disengagement took place in a rather sudden and quick manner just before the BRICS meeting in Xiamen, right? And that's when you had disengagement take place very, very quickly because Prime Minister Modi was supposed to be traveling for the BRICS meeting in Xiamen. And as with China hosting the meeting, you ended up seeing disengagement happen. Now, while China is not the host of this meeting, it's happening, the SCO meeting is not happening in Kazakhstan, yet we are seeing, something like this. So that's probably the only explanation that I can think of as to why right now. It is to create the groundwork for potentially a bilateral meeting between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi in Samarkand at the sidelines of the SCO summit. And again, this summit is useful, right? It's really, really important from Beijing's point of view and from Moscow's point of view because it comes at a time when there is tremendous friction with Beijing and Moscow on one side in some ways, with the United States and the West on the other side, and India has sort of been a not a swing state, but India is a state which is leaned towards the West, but also balanced its ties with Moscow and Beijing in some ways. So I think this is in that context, in that broad geopolitical context, in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, along with the fact that you want the environment in place for a bilateral meeting. So that's the best sort of that I can think of as to why this is happening.
So, since you think that bilateral meeting between President Xi Jinping and PM Modi is a real possibility on the sidelines of the SCO summit next week, and the latest disengagement is somehow signaling that could happen, could you tell us about what does this mean for the broader India-China relationship? Is this a signal towards returning to some sort of normality in the near future? Do you think that is going to happen?
I would struggle to think that we would go back to some sort of normalcy that existed pre-April 2020. I think that, over the last 2 and a bit years, this standoff, the pandemic, the changing geopolitical environment, India's own sense of its position in the world, all of that has sort of structurally altered the dynamic of the India-China relationship. And if we are to arrive at a normal, it has to be a new normal. So from the point of the LAC to begin with, right? Disengagement, like I said, is simply about stepping back from being in close proximity, creating a buffer zone so that you don't necessarily have escalation and both sides step back. To me, that's not necessarily a favorable position for India to be in, because the Chinese troops had come to forward positions, blocked India from patrolling locations that Indian troops would traditionally patrol, and then now we've created a buffer zone. So regardless, Indian troops don't have access to the areas that they used to patrol pre-April 2020. So it's not necessarily a favorable situation. You've given up the right to access to some of these places, at least temporarily. This is not a long-term solution. The second thing is that because of the heightened tensions, both sides had brought additional troops to sort of, both sides had escalated and brought additional troops, not necessarily to forward positions, but in sort of ready areas, so that, in case of escalation, you have troops that are ready. And estimatedly, both sides have brought up deployments of about 50,000-60,000 troops. It was the Chinese who enhanced troop deployments first, and then India sort of mirrored those deployments. So what you've done is that you've expended far greater energy, and for that de-escalation to take place, where these troops go back to bases where they were in the past, I think is some time away, if at all we are going to see that, because this nature of the LAC has changed. The LAC used to be essentially an area where trust and mutual agreement, allowed you both to patrol. A lot of areas were not necessarily patrolled on a regular basis. There were no regular deployments because the terrain is extremely harsh, extremely cold, and you didn't necessarily need regular deployments because you had, confidence building agreements, you had protocol measures on the ground in terms of how patrol took place, and those functioned well until they started to come under strain, in the early part of the 2010, 11, 12 period, and then gradually increasingly those have come under pressure until we reach this breaking point in 2020, which led to the clashes in Galwan. So fundamentally some things have changed. I mean, the fact that, as per the agreements, you're not supposed to be carrying lethal weapons, but clearly in this round of tensions over the last 2 years, we've had not just deaths, and one can claim that those were not deaths because of, shooting, but those were sort of, that was different kind of violence in Galwan. But we have heard of shots being fired, particularly in August, September 2020, when there was a race between the two sides to capture heights along the Kailash range. So I think that, the nature of the LAC and the trust that existed has broken down. To rebuild that, to have de-escalation, is a long-term process. It's not a short-term process. So that's going to take time. And a lot of this will depend on how Beijing behaves. There's that famous Chinese saying, right? He who ties the knot must undo it. It's for Beijing to undo this. And I don't see any great interest or incentive in Beijing to do that. So for that one reason, I think that, that's the first reason why I think ties are not going to go back to any time to what we called normal in the past. The other thing is that, the India-China relationship is in a phase of structural competition and rivalry. If you just go back to the spat between the Indian embassy and the Chinese ambassador and embassy in Sri Lanka a couple of weeks ago in August over the visit of that surveillance vessel in Sri Lanka. And you will see that, the Chinese embassy and ambassador had made comments about India being aggressive oblique comments without referencing India, but talking about Indian aggression with regard to its neighbors. And the Indian embassy had pushed back, talking about China's, the PRC's policies with regard to Taiwan, which was seen as a shift in Indian policy. I think that just tells you about the fact that this friction is about much more than just what's happening at the border immediately. It's about the sense of the two sides in terms of their role within the broader Indo-Pacific or broader Asia, and their own sense of aspiration with regard to the global role that both these countries see for themselves. So, apart from just immediate border interests, it's about regional interests, it's about development interests, and it's about aspirations of both countries in terms of where they see their role as international powers. And that's structural, that's not going to go away. Another sort of example of this is if you go back to, there are two speeches by Foreign Minister Jaishankar in August, right? One was during a visit to Indonesia on August 18th, and the other was at the launch of the Asia Policy Institute. And I recommend that anybody who wants to understand why the India China relationship is stuck in this sort of structural challenge, it's really useful to go through those speeches. I mean, in Indonesia, you see Foreign Minister Jaishankar specifically talk about the Quad, and he calls the Quad the most important plurilateral platform that addresses contemporary challenges and opportunities in the Indo-Pacific. He talks about the role of India's sort of changed role in the region, and he talks about, therefore, how, and again, this is what China sees as its traditional sort of domain, right, East Asia. And he talks about the Quad being significant to this part of the world, which I'm sure Beijing will not welcome. Likewise, at the Asia Policy Institute, again, a tremendously important speech, because I think that was I think that's the strongest language that we've heard from, and the clearest sort of criticism that we've heard from India in recent times about China's overall policy. I mean, he talked about how, China talks about an Asian century, and he said that as a prerequisite for the Asian century to come, you need to see India and China coming together, and their inability to do so will undermine this idea of the Asian century. And at the same time, he infuses this dose of realism, where he says that, now, there is a lot of talk about, Asia for Asians, which is a phrase that Xi Jinping has used quite often. And he says that this suggestion could be the basis of a united front that could be formed. But this presumes stronger convergence within the continent than reality indicates. So that's, to me, as honest and clear a sense. He talks about the Bandung spirit and saying that, look, the experience of the past affirms that Asians are second to none when it comes to realpolitik. And he talks about the failure of the Bandung spirit. So I think it's a really biting speech. He talks about an inclusive vision for Asia, which India sort of talks about, and he rebukes China's exclusivist vision of Asia in that speech. Which just tells you again that this is not just about the boundary, this is not just about trade imbalances, this is about a structural challenge in the relationship.
So I have a couple of questions for you. One on the new normal that you spoke about, and secondly on the Asian century and the divergence in the idea of Asian century among the Indians and the Chinese. So firstly on the new normal, going back to the border issues, do you think this is probably it? That the disengagement takes place and there is no further de-escalation on the border, no going back to the status quo as it existed, and India will somehow either have to be happy with what has happened or be constrained to accept it. In such a situation, what do you think Indian interest is going to be? How is India going to respond? Or will China be willing to make certain other trade-offs to make India more agreeable to the disengagement that has taken place and accept that as the new normal?
Right. So, look, I think that if I was to think of it from a Chinese strategic thinker's perspective, you have created a new normal along a certain part of the line of actual control. You have asserted your claim going back to the 1959 line that the Chinese apparently claimed. And you've pushed the Indian armed forces back, at least in some areas, and you've blocked them, particularly in the Debsan Plain, from accessing a strategic area. So I think that tactical outcome for China, for the PLA on the ground, is not necessarily bad. And I presume that they will, I don't see the incentive for them to step back from it, particularly knowing the fact that, if they have to make this concession because they have gained this advantage, if you have to make this concession of saying, let's de-escalate, let's go back to where things were, and let's try and rebuild confidence, what is the incentive for Beijing to do that? The cost of forward deployment for China, and this escalation that's happened in terms of bringing 50, 60,000 troops forward and expanding infrastructure, expanding air bases and things like that, To me, that cost of escalation is not something that Xi Jinping is particularly worried about. He has far more money to spend than New Delhi does. The cost of escalation, in fact, is something that he would like to continue to impose on India, because India has been talking about expanding its maritime power. And when you have continental threats escalated, it's really difficult to divert your resources towards maritime power development. So while India wants to do that, what Xi Jinping has done and what the PLA has done, it sort of complicates that process for India, right? If your continental terrain is peaceful, and you're not really spending as much anymore, or if you're spending like you were in the past, then you have more resources to spend on maritime power development. But in such a situation where you have to maintain a large force on the front line in hostile terrain and repeatedly carry out that, so it's not just about maintaining troops. You've got to house them, you've got to ensure food, you've got to ensure security, you've got to ensure supply chains. All of that keeps is costing you money. So it's a drain on the exchequer, which money you could have possibly used elsewhere in some ways. And your strategic focus also remains on the continental threat, because that is immediate and it is a political challenge to any government in power in India. So in that sense, I don't see the incentive for Beijing to pull back and say, okay, let's go back to where things were. Some might argue that, look, because India is a potential swing state in the US-China rivalry, and some might say that India's position during the Ukraine war sort of shows its ability to sort of swing and hedge and balance. And Beijing would be happy with that decision taken by India, because it shows that India is not entirely leaning towards the United States, but can balance and the fact that it wants to wean India further away from the US would create an incentive for Beijing to de-escalate and tell India that, look, we'll do this, but you don't lean towards the United States. Now the challenge with that is it requires Beijing to do something tangible, which is pull back, de-escalate, set up new protocols and adhere to them. From Beijing's point of view, what is the guarantee that India doesn't keep swinging and India doesn't keep going closer to the United States? So what are the tangibles that it can tell India, we don't want to see you do this, we don't want to see you crossing these red lines? And will India accept those red lines? Because it is in our legitimate interest to partner with the United States on many things, whether it's defense acquisition, whether it's military training, whether it's trade. I mean, the US is our biggest trading partner today. Whether it's talent, all of this stuff. India is much closer to the United States economically, militarily, than it will ever be to China. So, is there something tangible that China can take from India, that it can desire from India, so that its anxiety that it may have that India will, in a conflict between the US and China, India will sort of lean towards the United States? I mean, what can we do to ease that anxiety? And what can we do to sort of provide tangibly? I don't see anything tangible that India can offer. Or even if we can offer something tangible that Beijing will accept and say, okay, this eases our anxiety. Because let's look at it this way. Before 2017, in 2007, 2008, when the first idea of the Quad came up, it died very quickly. Not because of India, but it died very quickly. Subsequently, when the idea of the Quad has come up, it's gradually been built up at junior diplomat level conversation, sort of undersecretary level conversation, to finally reaching a foreign minister level. But it only became a leader level dialogue, and it sort of accelerated after tensions increased between India and China. So India sort of flung itself full-fledged into the Quad after these tensions grew. Not to say that again that momentum wasn't there. There was momentum before, but the tensions with China sort of put India over the edge in some ways. So that's a strategic loss for Beijing. The pressure was counterproductive from their point of view. So it's a difficult position for even from a Chinese point of view, right? What would you accept from India to say that it's okay, we will go back to some degree of normalcy? Because even from their point of view, they see India as a potential threat, not just because of its partnership with the US, but because India is a large democratic country, which is a very different model of managing economy, society, and diversity, which presents a challenge to the Chinese model, right? The Chinese, one of the biggest advantages and one of the biggest claims of the Communist Party is that its model is superior because it has delivered growth and delivered development for a population as large, diverse, which had experienced colonial subjugation. And the only way to do that, or at least one of the key ways to do that, is this CCP model. But if suddenly you see in India, which is democratic, which has values freedom, which has separation of powers, which has all of those sort of, so-called quote unquote ideas of liberal democracy in it, being prosperous as your neighbor, it, and also becoming a major power, it then sort of provides an implicit challenge to the CCP model. So for many reasons, this relationship is going to remain very difficult. And on the border, therefore I don't see any significant thaw taking place. I think India will have to get used to the fact that this is going to remain a volatile and difficult border.
So I have a final question to you, and this is about Asian century that you spoke about. So India looks at it very differently than China, right? India talks of an inclusive Asian century where it talks in terms of unity between India and China, and it indicates a desire for an equal partnership between the two biggest countries in Asia. However, China's vision is different, and China's vision is exclusive. It talks more in terms of China being the regional hegemon and India sort of playing the second fiddle. And this has been a long running theme between India and China and the rise of these two nations. And today, both nations are stronger economically, politically, militarily, and both have become more assertive in the way they go about their foreign policy. So, in this context, I know this is a bit speculative, but how do you think this? And I don't see these two visions coming together, right? So, it might seem a little speculative, but I wanted to know from you, how do you see this Asian century visions playing out geopolitically over the next in the short term to medium term?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing is that for any Asian century to take place, for anything of that nature to happen, I mean, you can see that, yes, geopolitically and economically, the balance of power has shifted towards the Asian region or the Indo-Pacific as a broad region, not just Asia. But Asia is still riddled with many challenges, many, regional hotspots, I mean, from Myanmar to the Middle East to Afghanistan. There are tremendous challenges that we have. Now, in terms of this idea of the Asian century, in language, even the Chinese vision is very inclusive, right? They talk about there being no, China not seeking hegemony, China believing that all countries must engage in deal with disputes through dialogue and peaceful means, and that all countries are equal and all that. So rhetorically, it's all good. When you look at Beijing's actions, right? When you look at the South China Sea, it's essentially gone ahead and created a new status quo. When you look at the India-China boundary, it's creating a new status quo. When you look at the China-Bhutan border dispute, it's creating a new status quo. Then when you look at in terms of governance norms, right, what Beijing has done in terms of the conversation with regard to the South China Sea Code of Conduct, it's essentially trying to keep what it says are extra-regional powers out of the region, which is complete nonsense because Indian companies, Russian companies have investments in the South China Sea and they are legitimate stakeholders. China is looking to dictate to other countries in the region, which are claimants in the South China Sea, that look, any engagement with these countries and their companies will have to require an approval. So in that sense, it is an exclusivist vision in terms of practice. Rhetorically, it's inclusive. In terms of practice, it is exclusivist. It is based on, Chinese power and the exercise of Chinese power, and that's how it's sort of seeking to change. In contrast, if you look at the Indian argument is that we all need to be working together and we need to be delivering public goods at present. Now, one can say that the Indian argument is also rhetorically inclusive, but will essentially imply a certain degree of exclusivist approach to it. For example, people will say that India communicated to the Sri Lankans that we would not be keen to see this Chinese vessel stopping by in Sri Lanka, but that is a sovereign decision by the Sri Lankan government. So in that sense, even India is looking at an exclusivist role. So to me, that's just part of how international relations takes place. The challenge with the Chinese sort of vision is its use of force and its increasing propensity to use force, which is tremendously destabilizing, and also the propensity to rewrite rules of multilateral engagement. For example, the South China Sea Code of Conduct, which you've not seen in India's case, right? India has not engaged in changing. So India is not talking, when it's talking in through BIMSTEC or through any of these other groupings, about excluding other powers. India is talking about having other powers play a role in it. If you go back to Jaishankar's speech at the Asia Policy Institute, he specifically talks about, the fact that there are resident powers in Asia, like the United States, and proximate ones like Australia, who have legitimate interests, and their contribution is invaluable in securing the global commons. So India is not talking about a vision which is saying that the Indian Ocean region is India's ocean, and therefore we want to exclude everybody. Whereas China is doing that in the South China Sea and it's shaping rules. So I see this sort of clash of visions inevitable in some ways. And I see countries in the region increasingly being forced into difficult choices that they will have to make. So I don't see necessarily a harmonization between the two, despite even if you get some sort of an agreement on the boundary. So this clash is only beginning. and it will continue for a period of time. Of course, it depends on how, the domestic situation in Beijing also evolves, right? Today, we are going to see in the next 1 month or so at the next 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping is likely to get the third term as General Secretary. He might also get new epithets like the People's Leader and things like that, which cement his position. But because of that concentrated one man rule in that system that's evolving, the moment Xi Jinping exits the scene, whether through a long retirement and how he exits the scene, will also shape China's future engagement in the world. So that volatility domestically could also have a role to play internationally. But in the near future, at least all things remaining the way they are, and with Xi Jinping remaining in power, expect to see much more friction between India and China, even in terms of their visions for the region.
Thanks, Manoj, for that illuminating discussion. So, right now, I think we should all look forward to the developments next week at Samarkand during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and let's take it from there on the future of India and China relations. Thanks once again for joining us, Manoj.
Thanks. Take care.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.